In the quiet little town of Oak Ridge Heights, life moved at a slow and steady pace. The streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges, colorful flower beds adorned front yards, and families often gathered for weekend barbecues. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name, and disputes rarely went beyond whose turn it was to mow the shared grass strip between driveways. For Sarah Thompson, this neighborhood had been her sanctuary, a peaceful retreat from the chaos of life as a single mother raising two kids on her own. Sarah's home wasn't grand or luxurious, but it was hers. Every inch of the cozy bungalow reflected her hard work and care. She spent hours tending to her backyard garden, planting rows of tomatoes, sunflowers, and lavender. Her children loved playing outside in the evenings, chasing fireflies under the soft glow of string lights she'd hung along the fence. To Sarah, that patch of land behind her house wasn't just dirt and plants. It was a piece of her heart, a space where memories were made. But all of that changed one sunny Saturday morning when an unwelcome presence disrupted the tranquility of Oak Ridge Heights. Karen Miller had recently moved into the vacant house next door. At first glance, Karen seemed harmless enough, well-dressed, always carrying a clipboard and eager to introduce herself to the neighbors. However, it didn't take long for people to notice something odd about her. She had a way of inserting herself into conversations, offering unsolicited advice, and making comments about things that weren't really her business. Within weeks of moving in, Karen became known as HOA Karen, thanks to her obsessive dedication to enforcing the Homeowners Association, HOA rules. Karen's behavior quickly escalated from mildly annoying to downright intrusive. She started sending emails to residents pointing out minor infractions like mismatched curtains or slightly overgrown lawns. She even called the city to complain about cars parked too close to fire hydrants, despite there being no actual violations. Some neighbors tried to humor her quirks, while others simply avoided crossing her path altogether. But Sarah never imagined that Karen would target her directly, and certainly not in such a dramatic fashion. It began early one Saturday when Sarah woke up to the sound of loud hammering echoing through the stillness of the morning. Confused, she pulled on her robe and stepped outside to investigate. What she saw left her speechless. A team of construction workers was busy building a tall wooden fence smack dab in the middle of what had always been her backyard. The fence cut straight across her tomato plants, splitting her garden in half. Shocked and furious, Sarah marched over to confront whoever was responsible. Standing nearby, clipboard in hand, was none other than Karen Miller. With a smug smile, Karen explained that the fence was necessary because the land technically belonged to the HOA, not Sarah. She waved around a stack of papers she claimed proved her point, though Sarah couldn't make sense of them in her state of disbelief. "This is ridiculous," Sarah protested. "I've lived here for years and this has always been my property." Karen shrugged nonchalantly, acting as if Sarah's outrage was completely unfounded. "I'm sorry if you misunderstood the boundaries," she said, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "But according to these documents, this land is considered community property. You'll have to take it up with the HOA." And with that, Karen turned away, leaving Sarah standing there fuming. The audacity of the situation hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. Not only had Karen invaded her personal space without warning, but she also acted like she had every right to do so. How could someone build a fence through another person's yard and justify it with vague legal jargon? Sarah felt violated, angry, and utterly powerless. As she looked around at the destruction of her once pristine garden, tears welled up in her eyes. This wasn't just about a few ruined tomato plants. It was about respect, fairness, and standing up for what was rightfully hers. Over the next few days, Sarah tried to reason with Karen, hoping to resolve the issue peacefully. But every attempt ended in frustration. Karen refused to budge, insisting that the fence stayed put until further notice. She even doubled down, accusing Sarah of being difficult and uncooperative. Other neighbors watched the escalating conflict with growing unease. Some sympathized with Sarah, knowing full well how unreasonable Karen could be. Others, however, kept their distance, afraid of becoming her next target. As the tension simmered, Sarah realized she needed more than just words to fight back. She decided to dig deeper into the matter, determined to uncover the truth about the disputed land. Little did she know this decision would set off a chain of events that would rock the entire neighborhood and expose secrets Karen had worked so hard to keep hidden. For now, though, Sarah stood alone, staring at the imposing fence that had suddenly become a symbol of injustice. Her mind raced with questions. Was Karen telling the truth about the land belonging to the HOA? Could she really get away with something like this? And most importantly, what could Sarah do to reclaim her yard and her peace of mind? The battle lines had been drawn, and Sarah knew she couldn't let Karen win. But as she prepared to fight back, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much bigger storm. As the days passed, Sarah found herself caught in a whirlwind of emotions: anger, frustration, and disbelief. Every time she looked out her kitchen window, the sight of that towering wooden fence reminded her of Karen's audacity. What had once been her serene backyard now felt like a battleground, with the fence serving as an ugly scar across her property. But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. She knew she had to act, but first she needed answers. Determined to prove that the land belonged to her, Sarah began gathering evidence. She started by digging through old files, pulling out every document related to her home ownership. There were property deeds, tax records, and even surveys conducted when she first bought the house years ago. Each piece of paper confirmed what she already knew: the disputed land was part of her property. But Karen's accusations still lingered in the air, and Sarah understood that having these documents wouldn't be enough. She needed someone who could interpret them and help her fight back legally. Her search led her to Mark Reynolds, a local attorney known for handling disputes involving homeowners associations. When Sarah walked into his office clutching a folder stuffed with papers, she felt a mix of hope and anxiety. Mark listened patiently as she explained everything, from Karen's sudden arrival to the construction of the fence and the ensuing confrontation. By the end of their meeting, he assured Sarah that she had a strong case. "Don't worry," he said with a reassuring smile. "We'll get to the bottom of this." While Sarah worked on building her legal defense, tensions in the neighborhood continued to rise. Karen, emboldened by her position within the HOA, became even more overbearing. She began patrolling the streets like a self-appointed enforcer, pointing out minor infractions and issuing warnings to anyone who dared step out of line. One day, she sent an email to the entire neighborhood chastising a family for leaving their trash bins out too long. Another time, she complained about a neighbor's holiday decorations being too bright and distracting. Her behavior grew increasingly erratic, leaving many residents feeling uneasy. For Sarah, things only got worse. Karen seemed determined to make her life miserable. She parked her car diagonally across Sarah's driveway, blocking access without explanation. When Sarah confronted her, Karen simply shrugged and said, "It's community parking space." On another occasion, Karen accused Sarah of violating HOA rules by planting non-native flowers in her garden, a claim so absurd that it left Sarah speechless. It was clear that Karen wasn't just trying to win the argument over the fence. She was waging a personal vendetta against Sarah. Despite the mounting pressure, Sarah refused to back down. With Mark's guidance, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA board, demanding that they address Karen's actions. At first, some members appeared sympathetic, acknowledging that Karen's behavior was excessive. However, others hesitated to take a stand, fearing retaliation or further conflict. Karen, ever the manipulator, used her influence to sway opinions in her favor. She claimed Sarah was stirring up trouble and insisted that the fence issue was merely a misunderstanding. Slowly but surely, Karen managed to turn some board members against Sarah, isolating her even further. Feeling cornered, Sarah poured all her energy into preparing for the upcoming hearing. She spent hours reviewing documents, taking photos of her damaged garden, and documenting every interaction with Karen. Neighbors who supported her offered moral support, sharing stories of how Karen had bullied them too. One elderly couple recounted how Karen had reported them for having a bird bath that was too close to the sidewalk. Another family described how Karen had demanded they repaint their front door because the color didn't match her vision of community aesthetics. These accounts painted a picture of a woman obsessed with control, willing to trample over anyone who stood in her way. Amidst the chaos, Sarah also discovered something surprising. Not everyone in the neighborhood was afraid of Karen. A small group of neighbors, inspired by Sarah's courage, began rallying behind her. They organized informal meetings to discuss ways to counter Karen's influence within the HOA. Some offered to testify on Sarah's behalf during the hearing, while others helped spread awareness about the situation through social media. For the first time since the ordeal began, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. She realized she wasn't alone in this fight. There were others who wanted to see justice served. As the hearing approached, Sarah's resolve hardened. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Karen was resourceful, cunning, and relentless. But Sarah had one thing Karen didn't: the truth. Armed with undeniable evidence and unwavering determination, Sarah prepared to face off against her adversary in a battle that would test her strength, patience, and resilience. Little did she know the drama was far from over, and the revelations yet to come would shake Oak Ridge Heights to its core. As the hearing date approached, Sarah felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. She had spent countless hours preparing her case, poring over documents, gathering witness statements, and consulting with Mark, her attorney. The evidence was clear. The disputed land belonged to her. But Sarah knew that Karen wasn't going to go down without a fight. If anything, Karen seemed more determined than ever to prove she was right, even if it meant bending the truth or outright fabricating it. The day of the hearing finally arrived, and the small conference room at the HOA office buzzed with tension. Neighbors packed into the space, curious to see how this dramatic showdown would unfold. Some were there to support Sarah, while others wanted to see what Karen would say next. A few members of the HOA board sat at the front, looking visibly uncomfortable as they prepared to mediate the dispute. The atmosphere was electric, with whispers filling the air and eyes darting between Sarah and Karen. Mark opened the proceedings by presenting Sarah's side of the story. He laid out the property deeds, tax records, and survey maps in meticulous detail, explaining how they clearly showed the boundary lines favoring Sarah. "This isn't just about a fence," he said firmly. "It's about respect for property, rights, and accountability. Ms. Thompson has lived here peacefully for years, maintaining her home and garden. Suddenly, someone decides to build a fence through her yard without any valid legal basis. That's not acceptable." Karen, seated across the table with her own stack of papers, didn't look fazed. She leaned forward confidently, interrupting Mark mid-sentence. "Let me stop you right there," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "These so-called documents are outdated and irrelevant. The HOA has always maintained jurisdiction over certain communal areas, including parts of Ms. Thompson's backyard. This is about protecting the integrity of our community, not personal vendettas." Her words drew murmurs from the crowd, but Mark remained calm. He countered Karen's claims by pointing out inconsistencies in her arguments. For example, the surveys she cited were decades old and hadn't been updated since the neighborhood was first developed. Modern property records, on the other hand, painted an entirely different picture, one that unequivocally supported Sarah's ownership of the land. Mark also highlighted surveillance footage Sarah had obtained, showing Karen personally directing the fence builders late at night, bypassing any official approval process. At this revelation, the room fell silent. The video clip played on a laptop screen, capturing Karen giving instructions to the workers under the dim glow of a street lamp. It was damning evidence proving that Karen had acted unilaterally without consulting anyone, not the HOA board, not the neighbors, and certainly not Sarah. Her face turned red as gasps rippled through the audience. Even some of her staunchest supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing they might have backed the wrong horse. Undeterred, Karen tried to deflect attention away from herself. "This footage is taken out of context," she snapped. "I was merely ensuring compliance with HOA guidelines. Someone had to take charge when no one else would." But her excuses sounded hollow, especially when Mark produced additional evidence, showing that Karen had ignored multiple requests for clarification before proceeding with the construction. Emails, text messages, and even handwritten notes documented Sarah's repeated attempts to resolve the issue peacefully, all of which Karen had brushed aside. As the hearing progressed, cracks began to form in Karen's carefully constructed facade. One particularly damning moment came when Mark cross-examined her about the authenticity of the documents she claimed proved the HOA's ownership of the land. Under scrutiny, Karen struggled to explain why key sections of those papers appeared altered or inconsistent with current zoning laws. When pressed further, she became defensive, accusing Mark of twisting facts and trying to discredit her reputation. By the end of the session, it was clear that Karen's defense was crumbling. The HOA board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the direction things were heading. Several openly questioned whether Karen had acted appropriately or legally in building the fence. One member, a retired school teacher named Mr. Harris, spoke up during the deliberation phase. "We can't ignore the evidence here," he said firmly. "Ms. Miller may have good intentions, but her actions have caused significant harm to Ms. Thompson and undermined trust within our community. We need to address this properly." When the verdict was announced, it was a decisive victory for Sarah. The HOA ruled that Karen must remove the fence immediately and compensate Sarah for damages to her property. They also issued a formal apology to Sarah for allowing the situation to escalate unchecked. While the ruling brought relief, Sarah knew this wasn't the end of the road. Karen stormed out of the room, slamming doors and muttering angrily under her breath. It was obvious she wasn't going to let this go quietly. In the days following the hearing, whispers spread throughout Oak Ridge Heights. Neighbors who had previously feared crossing Karen began speaking out about their own experiences with her. Stories emerged of her bullying tactics, unreasonable demands, and attempts to micromanage every aspect of the neighborhood. Some revealed how Karen had pressured them into signing agreements they didn't fully understand, while others recounted instances where she had reported minor infractions to authorities without cause. Sarah found herself at the center of a growing movement to reform the HOA. Encouraged by her bravery, residents banded together to push for greater transparency and accountability within the organization. They drafted petitions calling for regular audits of HOA finances, clearer communication channels, and stricter enforcement of ethical standards. Slowly but surely, the power dynamics in the neighborhood began to shift. Meanwhile, Karen retreated into isolation, nursing her wounded pride. But far from accepting defeat, she grew increasingly bitter. Late at night, neighbors reported seeing lights on in her house as she paced back and forth, muttering to herself. Rumors swirled that she was planning some kind of retaliation against Sarah and her allies. No one knew exactly what she had in mind, but one thing was certain: Karen wasn't done fighting yet. For Sarah, the victory was bittersweet. On one hand, she felt vindicated knowing that justice had been served. On the other hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's toxic presence still loomed over the neighborhood. As she stood in her backyard, watching workers dismantle the hated fence, Sarah allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. The battle had been hard fought, but she had proven that standing up for what's right, even in the face of overwhelming odds, was worth it. Yet deep down, Sarah sensed that the drama was far from over. Something about Karen's behavior suggested there was more to uncover, secrets lurking beneath the surface waiting to be exposed. And as the pieces of the puzzle slowly came together, Sarah realized that the truth might be even more shocking than anyone could have imagined. The victory at the HOA hearing should have brought closure for Sarah, but instead it only seemed to fan the flames of Karen's resentment. While the fence was finally removed and Sarah received compensation for the damages, Karen's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She stopped attending neighborhood events, avoided eye contact with her neighbors, and spent most of her time holed up in her house. But behind closed doors, she was plotting her next move. Sarah noticed subtle changes in the weeks following the ruling. Her mailbox, once a reliable source of bills and occasional letters from family, now contained anonymous notes filled with cryptic threats. "You think you've won?" One read, "This isn't over." Another warned, "People like you don't belong here." The handwriting was shaky but deliberate, and though there was no signature, Sarah didn't need one to know who was responsible. It wasn't hard to guess. Karen had always been fond of leaving passive-aggressive messages, and these felt like an escalation of that same pattern. At first, Sarah tried to brush it off. She told herself that Karen was just lashing out because she'd lost the fight over the fence. But as the notes kept coming and became more menacing, Sarah started to feel uneasy. She confided in Mark, her attorney, who advised her to document everything. "If this escalates further," he said, "we'll need evidence to protect you." Meanwhile, Karen's actions weren't limited to anonymous notes. Neighbors began reporting strange occurrences around their homes. One morning, Mrs. Patel found her prized rose bushes trampled, their stems snapped clean off. Across the street, Mr. Jenkins discovered his car tires slashed overnight. Though none of these incidents were directly linked to Karen, the timing was suspicious. Many suspected she was retaliating against those who had spoken out against her during the hearing. Tensions reached a boiling point when someone spray-painted the word "liar" across Sarah's garage door late one night. The bright red letters stood out starkly against the white paint, drawing stares from passers-by the next morning. Sarah felt violated all over again. This wasn't just about a property dispute anymore. It was personal. Determined not to let fear take hold, she filed a police report and installed security cameras around her property. Still, the sense of unease lingered. As if things couldn't get worse, another bombshell dropped, one that would change everything. During a routine review of HOA records, Sarah's legal team stumbled upon something shocking. Karen had been using forged signatures on official documents. Emails, meeting minutes, and voting records revealed inconsistencies that pointed to blatant fraud. It turned out Karen had manipulated decisions affecting the entire neighborhood for months, if not years. For example, she had allegedly falsified approval for expensive landscaping projects that benefited her own property, while saddling the rest of the HOA with the cost. She had also doctored membership votes to push through controversial policies, without proper consent. When this information came to light, it sent shockwaves through Oak Ridge Heights. Residents were furious, not just at Karen's dishonesty, but at how easily she had exploited the system. A special emergency meeting was called to address the allegations. This time, Karen showed up looking disheveled and defensive, clutching her clipboard like a shield. When confronted with the evidence, she initially denied everything, accusing Sarah and her supporters of fabricating lies to ruin her reputation. But as more examples of tampered documents surfaced, her denials fell flat. One particularly damning piece of evidence came from a former HOA board member who had grown disillusioned with Karen's leadership style. He provided copies of emails showing how Karen had pressured him into signing blank sheets of paper under the guise of administrative purposes. Those same sheets later appeared bearing signatures approving dubious expenditures and policy changes. His testimony painted a chilling picture of manipulation and abuse of power. As the weight of the accusations mounted, even Karen's closest allies began distancing themselves. Some admitted they had suspected foul play but were too afraid to speak up earlier. Others expressed regret for enabling her behavior by staying silent. By the end of the meeting, Karen was stripped of her position on the HOA board and banned from participating in future activities. The decision was unanimous, leaving her visibly shaken, but the fallout didn't stop there. Authorities launched a formal investigation into Karen's activities, focusing not only on the forgery allegations but also on potential misuse of HOA funds. Detectives combed through financial records, uncovering discrepancies that suggested Karen had funneled thousands of dollars into personal accounts. Receipts for luxury items, designer handbags, spa treatments, and even vacations were traced back to HOA credit cards, raising serious questions about embezzlement. News of the scandal spread quickly, turning Karen into a local pariah. Reporters descended on Oak Ridge Heights, eager to cover the downfall of the infamous HOA Karen. Television crews parked outside her house, and neighbors whispered about her misdeeds whenever she ventured outside. Once admired or feared for her relentless pursuit of perfection, Karen was now seen as a cautionary tale, a woman whose obsession with control had spiraled out of control. For Sarah, the revelations brought a mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt vindicated knowing that Karen's misconduct extended far beyond her backyard fence. On the other hand, she couldn't help but feel sorry for the woman who had isolated herself so completely. Karen's life was unraveling before everyone's eyes, and there was little anyone could do to stop it. The final blow came when police arrived at Karen's doorstep one evening, armed with a warrant for her arrest. Neighbors gathered on their porches, watching in stunned silence as officers led her away in handcuffs. Charges included forgery, fraud, and embezzlement, among others. As Karen climbed into the squad car, her head bowed in shame, Sarah stood quietly in her driveway, watching the scene unfold. It was surreal, the culmination of months of stress, anger, and uncertainty. In the days that followed, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. Without Karen's constant interference, life in Oak Ridge Heights began to return to normal. People resumed their routines, hosting barbecues and chatting over fences without fear of reprisal. For Sarah, the experience had been exhausting, but it had also strengthened her resolve to stand up for what was right. She realized that fighting injustice required courage, persistence, and community support, and that together, people could overcome even the most daunting challenges. Still, as Sarah looked out at her repaired garden, now blooming with fresh flowers and vegetables, she couldn't shake the feeling that the scars left by Karen's actions would take time to heal. Trust had been broken, and rebuilding it wouldn't happen overnight. But for the first time in months, Sarah felt hopeful. The storm had passed and the sun was shining again. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she wasn't alone, and that made all the difference. Karen's arrest marked the beginning of a new chapter for Oak Ridge Heights. The once feared HOA Karen was now a distant memory, replaced by headlines about her legal troubles and the scandal that had rocked the neighborhood. As news of her charges spread, forgery, fraud, embezzlement, it became clear that her downfall wasn't just about a backyard fence dispute. It was a story of unchecked ambition, greed, and the lengths someone might go to maintain control. For Sarah, this moment brought both vindication and reflection. In the weeks following Karen's arrest, life in the neighborhood slowly began to heal. Neighbors who had been too intimidated to speak out before now found their voices. Stories poured in about how Karen had manipulated, bullied, or outright lied to get her way. Some recounted how she had pressured them into paying for unnecessary repairs or signing contracts they didn't fully understand. Others shared tales of how she had reported minor infractions to authorities, turning small issues into major headaches. These revelations painted a picture of a woman consumed by a need for power and willing to hurt anyone who stood in her path. But with Karen gone, there was also an opportunity for renewal. Residents came together to reform the HOA, determined to ensure nothing like this could happen again. They drafted stricter guidelines for financial transparency, requiring regular audits and open meetings where everyone could voice concerns. A new board was elected, made up of trusted neighbors who prioritized fairness and community spirit over rigid enforcement. For the first time in years, people felt hopeful about the future of Oak Ridge Heights. Sarah played a key role in these changes. Her courage in standing up to Karen inspired others to do the same. She became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even when faced with overwhelming odds, it was possible to fight back and win. Many neighbors approached her to express gratitude, thanking her for exposing Karen's wrongdoing and giving them the courage to speak up. Though Sarah never sought recognition, she appreciated the support and camaraderie that emerged from the ordeal. Still, the scars left behind weren't easy to erase. Karen's actions had created divisions within the community, pitting neighbor against neighbor as some sided with her during the dispute. Rebuilding trust took time, but residents were committed to moving forward. Community events helped bridge gaps, bringing people together through shared experiences. Potluck dinners, holiday parties, and volunteer projects gave everyone a chance to reconnect and focus on what truly mattered, building a safe, welcoming place to call home. For Sarah, personally, the aftermath of the conflict was bittersweet. On one hand, she was relieved to have closure. The fence was gone, her garden was thriving, and her kids could play freely in the yard without reminders of Karen's intrusion. Yet, the emotional toll of the battle lingered. There were nights when she lay awake replaying everything, the confrontations, the stress, the fear that things might not work out. But those moments were balanced by pride in knowing she hadn't backed down. She had fought not only for herself but for her family and her community. As months passed, Sarah noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Flowers bloomed brighter, front porches were decorated with care, and laughter echoed through the streets. Once more, people seemed lighter, freer, as though a weight had been lifted off their shoulders. Even the HOA meetings, which had once been tense and contentious, became collaborative spaces where ideas flowed freely. Residents worked together to improve common areas, plant trees, and organize events that celebrated the unique character of Oak Ridge Heights. Meanwhile, updates about Karen trickled in sporadically. Legal proceedings dragged on, with court dates stretching into months. Evidence continued to pile up against her, including additional instances of fraudulent activity beyond the scope of the original investigation. Friends and acquaintances testified about how Karen had exploited relationships for personal gain, painting a fuller picture of her manipulative behavior. By the time the trial concluded, Karen faced multiple convictions and hefty fines. Sentenced to probation and community service, she faded from public view, retreating into obscurity. Though justice had been served, Sarah couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for Karen. At some point, she must have been a different person, someone driven by passion rather than greed, someone who genuinely cared about her community. Somewhere along the line, however, that version of Karen had been lost, replaced by a woman so desperate for control that she destroyed everything around her, including herself. It was a sobering reminder of how unchecked ambition could lead to ruin. Despite the challenges, Sarah emerged from the experience stronger and wiser. She learned valuable lessons about perseverance, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. More importantly, she rediscovered the value of community. Through the darkest moments of her struggle, she had relied on her neighbors for support, and they had risen to the occasion. Together, they proved that unity could overcome division, and kindness could triumph over cruelty. One evening, as Sarah sat on her porch watching the sunset, she reflected on how far they'd come. The air smelled sweet with the scent of blooming jasmine, and the sound of children laughing filled the background. Her own kids chased fireflies across the yard, their giggles carrying on the breeze. This was what she had fought for, not just a piece of land, but a sense of peace, belonging, and connection. Looking around at the vibrant neighborhood, Sarah realized something profound. Adversity had tested them, but it had also brought them closer. They had weathered the storm together, emerging stronger and more united than ever. And while the scars of the past would always remain, they served as a reminder of what they'd overcome, and a testament to the strength of a community that refused to give up. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Sarah smiled softly to herself. Life in Oak Ridge Heights wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference.